We have good news. President Cyril Ramaphosa is literally trying to create heaven on earth. Once the ruling ANC had adopted a policy that land should be expropriated without compensation at its 54th National Conference in December 2017, Cyril Ramaphosa, its newly elected president, said that taking the land owned by white farmers should increase food production and that South Africa could turn into the ultimate paradise if the implementation of the policy of expropriation of land without compensation leads to higher food production. He added, "We can make this country the Garden of Eden." But then again, as we know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Or, as Friedrich Hayek used to say, hell on earth has always been created by people who tried to create heaven on earth. It is no secret that the Soviet Union was and probably still is the single biggest influence in framing the ANC's ideological framework. Much of the ANC's rhetoric on the working class, transformation, monopoly capital and even land reform is taken directly from the terminology of the Soviet Union. It has been so successful in this that many in the ANC regularly quote communist leaders like Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Lenin unconsciously, thinking that they are simply expressing their own thoughts. During the past year, a great fuss was made by the ANC about the Bolshevist revolution of 1917, in which Lenin and the communists took power, eventually leading to the founding of the Soviet Union and Stalin's dictatorship. Stalin despised the idea of private property and land ownership by individuals, mostly because he wasn't able to exercise full control over the property owned by individuals. In pure Marxist terms, his idea was to create some sort of utopia, or heaven on earth, much in the same way that President Cyril Ramaphosa aims to turn South Africa into the ultimate paradise and to recreate the Garden of Eden by executing expropriation without compensation. And those are his words, not mine. As a result, in 1930, Stalin announced that the policy of collectivized farms would be instituted across the Soviet Union. This was essentially a policy of expropriation without compensation, a policy of nationalization of land. The notion in the Soviet Union, as is currently the case in South Africa, was that the government should act as a custodian of the land in the interest of all the people. The idea was that people would produce millions of tons of wheat under this new state-driven policy, which the state would then sell to purchase machinery, to build farming equipment, to invest in agricultural development, and so forth. Farms were divided into state-owned farms and forced collective-owned farms, managed according to the notion of a socialist self-management system. The projected goal was to increase agricultural production by 50% as a result of these policies. In order to achieve this, the Soviet Union had to initiate an assault on private property, which resulted in a backlash from farmers who had to give up their farms, and they were derogatorily referred to as the kulaks. A kulak was any farmer who used hired labor, who owned a mill, a creamery, a potato farmer, mechanical agricultural equipment with a motor, or livestock. Government clamped down with violence on those who resisted this policy. The vague definition used to refer to kulaks was also very convenient, as it opened the door to false accusations, to score settling, and the use of violence against political targets. Items taken from the kulaks by force included their winter clothes, undergarments, their shoes, pillows from under their children's heads, and even religious items, most of which were simply burnt after confiscation. Over 5 million kulaks were sent to concentration camps, and over 3 million were shot or died in exile or in these camps. Children betraying their parents by giving them up to the government were celebrated as national heroes while their parents were murdered. The state eventually took over all land, which was then to be farmed collectively in large units. By 1940, 97% of Soviet agriculture was collectivized. Between 1928 and 1950, the total amount of cows in the Soviet Union declined by 26%, pigs by 20%, sheep by 18%, and horses by 65%. The result was an unprecedented famine. Over 5 years, about 7 million people died of starvation as a result of this project. Bodies were piled on wagons and dumped in mass graves. Corpses were piled up like bales of straw, remembers one survivor. Many of these bodies, however, were still alive, moving and talking to the authorities, but when people were viewed as near dead, they were treated by the authorities as dead bodies. The more the project failed, the more the kulaks were blamed, and the more it was proclaimed that the desired result would be achieved if only the policy was implemented more aggressively. According to official Soviet statistics, some 24 million kulaks disappeared from rural areas, of whom only 12.6 million moved to state jobs. Stalin himself was said to have confided to Winston Churchill in 1945 that about 10 million people have died as a result of his land grab policies. The death toll for the entire project was somewhere around 12 million, double that of the Jewish Holocaust in Nazi Germany. Similar policies were implemented in virtually every communist-inspired country, all with their own unique flavor, adopted by the local communist leaders. This includes China under Mao Zedong, Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, Cambodia under Pol Pot, Cuba under Fidel Castro, North Korea under Kim Jong-il, and more recently, Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe and Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. The similarities between these cases were that they were all state-driven, that private property was despised, that violence eventually erupted as a result of a backlash by those whose property was targeted, that agriculture and food production collapsed, and that famine was experienced. Almost all of these leaders are in some way regarded as heroes by the ANC and other left-wing movements such as the EFF, who hail these policies as inspirational. Despite this, we are still frequently confronted by political commentators and left-leaning journalists who respond to criticism of the ANC's land reform policy with, "But how will we know whether it will work or not if we don't at least try it?" This is reckless talk, to say the least. State-driven reform programs in which the right to own private property is targeted have been tried and tested repeatedly and have resulted in disaster without exception. Not counting the murderous campaigns, the Soviet project back in the 1930s can perhaps only slightly be partly excused, as it was still a new idea at the time. It was an attempt to realize the philosophy of Marxism and an attempt to create the communist utopia that Karl Marx envisaged. History will, however, not forgive the ANC for trying to duplicate disastrous communist utopian policies. It isn't a new idea or an experiment anymore, but rather a tried and tested recipe for disaster, not only for those who own the property in the first place, but for all of those who live in the country. My name is Ernst, and this is your fact sheet.